Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Monday, the second, where we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, I hope you enjoyed the performance from the reconstructed Globe Theater. There have been multiple performances of A Midsummer Night's Dream there. I'm particularly fond of this performance because one of my favorite characters, which was a question that I had asked you in a discussion forum, is Bottom. In my opinion, I've never seen a better Bottom. I think he's absolutely hilarious. I'm a bit disappointed, to be quite honest with you, with Puck. And that was another question that I asked you for your discussion forum. I've seen better Pucks, and Puck is played by a lot of different types of actors. Could be an adult or a child, could be a man or a woman, very much kind of like a Peter Pan figure. And I think the casting choice is obviously going to influence the way that we experience that particular character, which is one of the ways or one of the reasons why I wanted you to watch A Midsummer Night's Dream, because it's not only about the text that's on the page, but obviously the actors, based on the directors, of course, interpretation. And what you see in the version that we viewed is a rather faithful adaptation of the text. Of course, they took some liberties. Obviously, there was no moonwalk, for instance, in Shakespeare's time. But nevertheless, I think you really get a sense of the plot of the play. And I know that we're still in the place in the semester where we might be struggling with Renaissance language. And it does get easier as you continue to hear the language. And I wanted to talk a bit about the play. If you look at the notes below, the first act, and of course, we talked about the five-act structure of Shakespearean plays, that they would resemble a kind of pyramid, and that the first act would be on the bottom left hand side of the pyramid, and that would be introducing us to conflict and to character. And then as we move up the pyramid, act 2 would be the beginnings of conflict, and then act 3 would be the point or the pinnacle of the pyramid, and that would be the height of conflict. Act 4 would be the beginning of descent on the right side of the pyramid and the beginning of resolution. And Act 5 would be the resolution itself. Though, of course, Midsummer is slightly different in the sense that it appears that the play comes to a conclusion in Act 4. But Act 5 is just as important as any of the other acts. It's very Shakespearean to give us a play within a play. And this is known as metadrama, where you are drawing direct comparisons to the idea that you are play watching a play, and it allows Shakespeare lots of opportunities to make commentary not only about his own play, but about the profession of playwriting and play acting. But more on that in a few minutes, because in the first act is where we get our characters, and there are quite a few characters in a Shakespearean comedy. And in many ways, it's an ensemble cast. Think about the tragedies, for instance, Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello. The title will give you an idea of the main character. That's not the case with The Midsummer Night's Dream. And what's interesting about all of these characters is that they are in couplings that represent different stages of relationship. Because ultimately, we are watching and reading a comedy, and comedies are ultimately about love and all of its misunderstandings, but with a happy resolution, meaning no death. And there's also a good amount of music and dance. And I think you saw that in the production, that there's a lot of music and dance. So it's very artistic. And it's thought that these comedies were performed either immediately or after real weddings. So you want to make sure that you have the proper tone and the proper mood. And music and dance helps to do that. Our first characters, Theseus and Hippolyta, they are engaged, which is one level of relationship. And the way they became engaged was that King Theseus conquered Queen Hippolyta in war. This is a political union. This is a union of power. And this would not be terribly unusual during the Renaissance. Perhaps it's not unusual in some circles today, in contemporary times. So this would be a rather typical kind of love. And Hippolyta, being the queen of the Amazons, makes this even more interesting because the Amazons were a strong warrior, a female race. So the idea that Theseus has conquered this leads to the idea of gender dynamics in the play, which is a rather eyebrow raising thing considering the time period in which the play was written. So, as we continue on with another coupling, we have Hermia and Lysander who are dating, which is another stage of relationship, not quite as serious as engagement. They are happy with one another, but Hermia, who is short and dark, and this will be important for our understanding of the play, basically defies her father's will. This would be quite unusual during the time period because a daughter would be considered a father's property in effect, and that her responsibility was to follow her daughter's will. So what we've got here is a female, and a young female no less, defying the patriarchal structure of the time. So that would be quite eyebrow raising. And obviously, the father has his own opinions. He would prefer that his daughter be with Demetrius, but he doesn't give a particularly good reason because Demetrius and Lysander are very similar in terms of status and in terms of age. The reality is that the father wants this, the father being Aegeus, because he wants it. So if anybody in power has ever told you something because I said so. So this is another power play. The father's made a decision. How dare the daughter defy? And yet she does. And then we've got Demetrius, who is quite happy with being with Hermia, but Demetrius, previously, prior to the play, had been with Helena, who is, and soon will be, or will not be, Hermia's best friend. So this leads to another complicated dynamic of what happens to best friends when there is conflict about romantic relationships. While Hermia is short and dark, Helena is tall and blonde, and the epitome of beauty at the time period would be tall and blonde, which makes it even more stinging that it's Hermia, the short, dark woman, that has all of the attention from the men, and it's Helena, the tall, blonde woman, who does not. And this leads to the question of love being fickle, that once you commit yourself to someone, because Demetrius had committed himself to Helena, what responsibility, if any, is there to remain with that individual? And that love can be quite fleeting. Now, Helena's feelings haven't changed, and she continues to pursue Demetrius throughout the play, which is another kind of love, an unrequited love. In fact, one might even call her actions comparable to stalking in contemporary terms. Hermia, Helena, Demetrius, Lysander are basically of the a noble class, but Theseus and Hippolyta are of a higher class, king and queen. So notice how Shakespeare is also embedding different class structures as well as embedding different layers of relationship. And we are introduced to the fairy world, which in many ways mirrors the human world, even though one expects better from the fairies. Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania. They are married, which represents another stage of relationship. The fact that they are fairies illustrates another status. We've got nobles, we've got kings and queens, and now we've got fairies. The idea is that the fairies should be superior. If you'll remember what we talked about with the chain of being, everything has a hierarchy in society, and that includes the angels in heaven. God would be at the very top. The king and queen in the human world would be considered God's mouthpiece, and then individuals would be ranked based on status and gender and lots of other variables, age, and so forth. So they are bickering, and this is also an issue about control because Oberon wants a changeling and Titania does not want to give it up. Oberon doesn't give a good reason why he wants this changeling. So it's very comparable to Aegeus, that he's just made up his mind and he wants it. And how dare his wife question him. And she does indeed question him. In fact, she defies him, and she has forsworn his marriage bed. In other words, they are using sexual relations as a power play within their relationship, because she's denying him their marriage bed, their intimacy in a relationship. So you put all of that together and you see that all of these couplings share commonalities, and that there are power plays going on, and that all of these couples are different, and that they represent different stages and statuses, but all of them are experiencing difficulties in love. Now, Bottom is a laborer, and that's why he is called Bottom, in part because he's part of the bottom of the social scale. He's an idiot. He is single. And I think that's important, because some of the most perhaps moving and intelligent statements about relationship come from Bottom. Though Bottom is an idiot, for lack of a better word, he's an ass. And the fact that he's able to believe that a fairy could fall in love with him, even though this is all through the machinations of the magical juice, just shows how clueless he happens to be. And the idea that a fairy at the top of the social chain, the chain of being, could fall in love with somebody who's at the bottom, who is a literal and figurative ass at this point, Bottom the ass, shows that love is blind, leading to the rhetorical question of how many of us have fallen in love with an ass. Now, Bottom is an actor, and this gives a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to give some commentary about actors and acting in the play. And it turns out that Bottom is rehearsing a play about, well, love, because that play is going to basically mirror or parallel what we see in the play about love in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, some considerations: the title, for instance, Midsummer, which is a pagan holiday, actually, and it's not necessarily the midpoint of the summer, but it is the point in which the day is longest. So, when we talk about midsummer, this is a day that from pagan tradition would be associated with fertility, and the way that one celebrated it was through being fertile, sexual relations. You might have heard of May Day, which is a different day than Midsummer, but it is in a somewhat similar period. May Day is the 1st of May. And there's reference to May Day in the play, even though May Day is not referenced in the title. May Day is another pagan holiday that is celebrated through rituals associated with fertility. So if you know anything about the maypole, for instance, then you know that the tradition of the maypole goes back to pagan times, and the maypole was supposed to represent penis. More on this later. So, the idea that things are happening at night, the Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, night is the time when ultimately intimacy is more frequent, and it also is a time of mystery and a time of possibility for breaking the rules of the natural and of breaking the rules of the human world. And so it's very deliberately set in night and also in a dream. And the idea that love itself is like a dream, something that cannot be controlled, something that can be terrible, like a nightmare, or can be wonderful, something that perhaps is an illusion. Perhaps that's also a commentary on love, that love is temporary and an illusion. So we've got all of that embedded in there. What we see in the play is the difficulties and conflicts associated with love, and no one is immune, not even a fairy. We see how love can be magical, which is one of the reasons why magic juice is highlighted, because it is like being under a magical spell when one is in love. And love can be tragic, but it can be wonderful. It can be exhilarating, but it can be humiliating. It can be requited, or it can be unrequited. Think about how we talk about love. People fall in love. And when you fall, you don't have control. Usually falling is seen as something that's negative, something that you try to avoid. The beginning of the play is in the city, Athens. It was very common for Shakespeare to put his plays in exotic locales, such as Athens, but it may as well be in England because outside of that setting, it seems very British. And the city is supposed to represent the rule of law and man. But notice how Shakespeare very cleverly moves all his characters, or the major ones, into the forest or the wilderness, that which is wild or untamed. And that's where the characters no longer have to follow the laws of civilization or the laws of humanity, and they have much more freedom in the natural world. There is darkness in this comedy, and that's not too surprising for Shakespeare to oftentimes give us a sense of darkness, but because it's a comedy, we know that we will have a happy ending. But Oberon, for instance, the king of the fairies, is very dark and mean. And this changeling child actually comes from fairy tradition. Shakespeare would oftentimes use elements from the fairy folklore world, but adapt them to serve his creative process. So the changeling from the fairy folklore world is a child that was stolen in the middle of the night from a fairy. The child would be a human child that the fairy would kidnap and replace with a fairy child that had perhaps some sort of deformity or some sort of challenge. This is one of the ways that perhaps parents during the Renaissance could justify having a child that didn't live up to their expectations, that it was really a changeling. Now, Shakespeare took the idea of changeling, but he adapted it for his play, where basically, and this is explained by Queen Titania, the changeling is the son of a servant that served Titania, and this servant died in childbirth, and Titania feels this responsibility to raise the child. And now Oberon wants the child. We can speculate that perhaps Oberon feels jealous, but the reality is that he doesn't give a good justification as to why he wants this child. Just like Aegeus doesn't give a good justification as to why he wants his daughter to be with one man over another. The idea of the power play, that because I said so and as female you should follow blindly, is embedded in this text. And now we've got two females who are defying male power figures. So this is rather progressive considering the time period. And of course, we have Puck the fairy, perennial favorite. Many times actors will say this is the character that they want to play, Puck, because he's really controlling and manipulating the action. In many ways, Puck is almost like a Shakespeare figure, controlling and manipulating, which is what we see at the ending of the play when Puck gives his final goodbye and pseudo apology. But more on this later. Notice that Puck is not involved in a love relationship, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why Puck is able to have a certain level of clarity about relationships that the other characters are not able to have. Puck, in terms of his relationship with Oberon, is also interesting because Puck is supposed to be a servant, Oberon is supposed to be the master, and yet it turns out that in many respects, it seems like Puck is calling the shots, so to speak, that Puck is the one in control. And it almost reminds me of a hierarchy in the workplace where you have a CEO who's supposed to be basically at the top of the hierarchy, but it's really the administrative assistant who is controlling and organizing everything within the organization. And Puck makes what could be considered a mistake, or it could be deliberate, because Puck is also part of fairy folklore. There is such a thing as a Puck, also known as a Robin Goodfellow, who's known for basically being very mischievous. Not evil, can't have evil because this is a comedy, but we can have mischievous. He makes milk curdle, for instance, things of that nature. So, the plot, as we move forward, Theseus and Hippolyta are engaged, as I had indicated, and they're conquered in war, or Hippolyta has been conquered in war. This is a typical kind of love. The production that we saw showed this through mime. Very interestingly, they have the two actors who are playing Theseus and Hippolyta also playing the roles of Fairy Oberon and Titania, and this reinforces the idea that these are like parallel relationships, or these are parallel couplings, that Theseus and Hippolyta are the human king and queen, and Titania and Oberon are the fairy king and queen, yet both of these couplings have difficulties when it comes to love. One would expect better from fairies, but in the end, love makes everyone a fool. Dare I say, an ass. And yes, we have Hermia and Lysander who are dating, and Hermia defying her father, which would be a rather atypical love during the time period. We have Helena and Demetrius illustrating how fickle love can be because Demetrius doesn't love Helena anymore. But we know that ultimately Helena still loves Demetrius, and now Demetrius says he loves Hermia. And of course, that isn't reciprocated for either one of them, so we've got unrequited love. Fairy Oberon and Titania, representing the long married couple, arguing. And it doesn't so much even matter what they're arguing about because it is a power struggle. And Bottom and his cohorts, yes, they provide humor. This is a comedy after all. We want to have some humor. But it also is thematically significant because they're rehearsing a play about love. And Theseus, as one could expect, ultimately believes that the hierarchy should be maintained. So Hermia's father, Aegeus, who is basically at his wit's end, decides to approach the highest order of the land, which is King Theseus, to see if Theseus can make Aegeus's daughter, Hermia, do the right thing from his perspective, which is listen to his will, her father's will. And Theseus basically tells her to do so, or she will face a nunnery or death, which would not have been that unusual again during the time period, because again, a woman was seen as basically a father's possession and then ultimately a husband's possession. And Hermia and Lysander do what perhaps many young couples do. If you've ever heard of the play Romeo and Juliet, you know exactly what happens when two people are in love and families disapprove, is that just makes their love all the more strong. And they decide to run away into the woods. Remember, Athens' civilization. Woods is that which is untamed. They can work on their, or they can fulfill their natural desires, so to speak. And a mistake that perhaps Hermia makes is that she tells her best friend Helena that Hermia is going to be running away with the love of her life, which is Demetrius, and not listen to her father, or I'm sorry, the love of her life, which is Lysander, and not listen to her father who wants her to be with Demetrius. You can see that I too mix up the names, and this is very deliberate from Shakespeare to illustrate that one partner can be comparable to another, that even though we may maintain that our partners have unique elements that can't be replaced, Demetrius can be Lysander, Lysander can be Demetrius, Helena can be Hermia, Hermia can be Helena. We will see the couples mixing back and forth. So the idea that Helena knows what Hermia, her best friend, is going to be doing propels her to do something that's completely illogical. But love is illogical. Helena comes up with the plan that she's going to tell Demetrius that Hermia is running away. And in the hope that Demetrius will lose interest in Hermia and will want to be with Helena and be thankful that Helena gave him this information, which is absurd. The reality is that Demetrius does what is expected, that he's going to go into the woods and try to find Hermia. We aren't very rational when we're in love because Helena's actions don't make a lot of rationality. So Demetrius flees into the woods. We know that Hermia and Lysander are already in the woods. Obviously, Helena is going to chase after Demetrius because she has unrequited love. This gets our four couples in the woods. And of course, the king and the queen of the fairies live in the woods. They are invisible to the human eye unless they want to be visible. This will be important because at one point, Oberon says, it sounds rather artificial, I am invisible. And this is for us as audience to understand that. In fact, it's even thought that during the time of the Renaissance, an actor might have worn a particular costume to denote invisibility, perhaps a veil, for instance. So, Bottom decides to go into the woods. This is his rationale to rehearse the play because they won't be subject to disturbances in the way they would be if they stayed in town. So that gets Bottom into the woods. So Shakespeare has manipulated most of the major characters into the woods, very deliberately so that we can see how they are going to interact with one another. Fairy Oberon, who's so angry with his wife Titania, who won't give him the changeling and has denied him his marriage bed, comes up with a plot, and his scheme is to get Puck, the fairy servant, to distract Fairy Titania with love juice because, of course, thematically, when we are in love, we are blind. And what happens is that she will be so blinded with her new love because she will love the first thing that she sees after the love juice is placed on her eyes, that she will no longer care about things she previously cared about, such as a changeling, for instance. And that goes to show that when we are in love, our priorities change. And also, probably more because of empathy, because Oberon has been watching the young lovers in the forest or the wilderness, but also because it's thematically necessary to have this plot become convoluted. Oberon decides to help Helena. Perhaps he has some sympathy for her after all. He has his own love problems. And he instructs Puck to put love juice onto the man wearing the Athenian garb. That's supposed to be Demetrius, so that Demetrius will love Helena again, which he did prior to the play. And Puck, of course, is going to follow orders to the letter and put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. But there are two men wearing Athenian garbs because they don't use names. That means that Puck has the possibility of either making an innocent mistake and putting the love juice on the wrong man's eyes. So that is exactly what happens in the play. Or Puck, because he's mischievous, deliberately puts the love juice in the wrong man's eyes. And it'll depend on the actor playing Puck and the director on how they want to play that particular scene. It's ambiguous enough that it could go either way. But the reality is that what we're going to get is that now two men are going to eventually be in love with Helena, the tall blonde, rather than Hermia, because Puck needs to rectify his mistake, which he does by putting the love juice in the correct man's eyes, but he never removes the love juice from the wrong man's eyes. So now we've got two men who are in love with Helena rather than Hermia. So you can imagine the kind of conflict that will result. And whether Puck does it deliberately or not, we know that he certainly enjoys the result, because he is a mischievous fairy, so he finds it quite entertaining. Puck also decides on his own, as he sees Bottom and his cohorts rehearsing their play within a play, to turn Bottom into an ass, because he is an ass. This will work very nicely because when Queen Titania wakes up, the first thing she's going to see is Bottom, who is a literal but also figurative ass. But since love is blind, of course, because of the love juice, because love is like magic, ultimately she falls in love with Bottom the ass. And Oberon is quite pleased by this, showing how dark his character is. And then again, Puck puts the love juice, perhaps mistakenly, perhaps not, on Lysander's eyes. And then, of course, Puck will put the love juice on Demetrius's eyes. And now both men are in love with the tall blonde rather than with the short brunette. And a former best friendship is at risk now as both of the women argue with one another, what I call the catfight scene. And notice that occurs in Act 3 when they are hurling insults at one another, Hermia and Helena. And if this were a tragedy, this would result in death. But this is not a tragedy. So we know that ultimately there's going to be resolution. And the way that we get resolution is that the love juice is removed from the wrong man's eyes. That happens to be Lysander, which means that he goes back to loving Hermia. The love juice remains on Demetrius's eyes, which you might say is somewhat unfair because he's being manipulated to love Helena. But again, prior to the play, he loved Helena, so perhaps this is just a restoration of order. The love juice will eventually have to be removed from Titania, who was so distracted when she was in love with an ass, Bottom, that allowed King Oberon to steal the changeling child and to get his way. One of the things we can expect from Shakespeare are no easy answers, in that when we are thinking about perhaps we've got a play where we've got a strong female who gets her way, the answer is that happens sometimes. Or perhaps we have a play where there's a strong female who does not get her way, and the answer is that happens sometimes. So, and this actually will relate to our first paper, which I will be talking about next class. The spell will ultimately need to be removed from Bottom the ass because he needs to return to human form. It would be cruel to keep him as an ass, but he still has the personality of an ass, so it's all good. And then we get King Theseus, who has to make a declaration. Remember the beginning of the play, where he was asked, basically begged by Aegeus to intervene and to make his daughter Hermia listen to her father's will. And what Theseus has done, and this is quite clever, I think, was to allow Hermia some time to consider the possibilities. This allows, obviously, for the play to unfold, so it's necessary from a plot perspective. But I think it's also clever from a political perspective, because all good politicians know that if they can avoid making a decision, then they're probably in a better position, because if they make a decision, they're going to alienate a group of people. The thing is that King Theseus now is going to be forced to make a decision, and King Theseus chooses the best of all possible worlds, at least for him, and that we've got the four nobles, the four young lovers, all happy that basically Hermia loves Lysander and Lysander loves Hermia, and Helena loves Demetrius, and now Demetrius loves Helena, albeit through that love juice, which is a complication. The only person who's unhappy at this point is the father, Aegeus. And King Theseus realizes he's not going to get a better outcome than this. So even though Aegeus isn't going to get his way, the four couples, or I should say the four humans who are two couples, are happy. So his resolution is that Aegeus must accept his daughter's will. And then to entertain themselves, they see a play. And again, very common for Shakespeare to provide us with a play within a play. It's a performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, two young lovers who experience a tragic end. And if you're watching and reading that play and you're reminded of Romeo and Juliet, you should be, because it's thought that Romeo and Juliet was written around the same time as A Midsummer Night's Dream. Even though scholars usually put the comedies at the beginning of Shakespeare's career and the tragedies sort of later in Shakespeare's career, he didn't necessarily write them all so that they could fit into specific genres for specific parts of his career. It's just that the bulk of the comedies would have been during the early part of his career. It's uncertain of the exact date of the play, so you might notice that dates oftentimes have the letter C in front of them, which means circa, which means that the play was written and performed around that time period. And if Romeo and Juliet came out beforehand, it's brilliant, because when we watch Pyramus and Thisbe, the fifth act, we would think of Romeo and Juliet, and we would know how well done Romeo and Juliet was, and we can use that as a comparison for how poorly Pyramus and Thisbe is done. Or the other way around, in that Romeo and Juliet is coming out after Midsummer Night's Dream. We see a poor performance in Pyramus and Thisbe, and then Shakespeare can basically advertise Romeo and Juliet as the good version of Pyramus and Thisbe, about two lovers who are kept apart and a tragic ending. And what we get with Pyramus and Thisbe is poor writing and poor acting and poor directing and poor production values. It's just poor all the way through. So not only does this serve as a contrast to Shakespeare's own writing and his ability to put on a play, not only does this illustrate the thematic issue of love, which could have gone awry in Act 3 when the women are arguing and then the men become involved, that love under certain circumstances can result in death. But it also is a way for Shakespeare to critique his competition and basically say to his competition that they are basically putting on performances such as Pyramus and Thisbe with bad acting and bad writing. And that is in direct contrast to Shakespeare. Pyramus and Thisbe also gives a wonderful opportunity for humor. A lot of it is slapstick, so you have to see it perform. And there's bawdiness. Shakespeare will have a good number of sex jokes in there. And as the major characters are watching the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, they're laughing at how absurd it is, but never once do they stop to think that they were equally absurd when it came to love, which goes to show a complete lack of insight from Helena and Hermia and Demetrius and Lysander, and also the king and queen Oberon the king and the queen Theseus and Hippolyta. So this is also a commentary on the idea of how little people have self-understanding. But the twist is on us, because if we were laughing as audience members at the writing and the acting and the directing and the production values of Pyramus and Thisbe, then we haven't taken a step back to examine our own behavior when it comes to love relationships. And what Shakespeare is suggesting is that we are equally as foolish, if not more so, when it comes to love. And if we don't understand that, by the time we watch Pyramus and Thisbe, we've learned nothing from the play. Obviously, this is a play that could offend many people on many different levels, which we'll talk about next class. So it's not surprising to get a final speech from Puck, because after all, Puck was the one who is controlling and manipulating everything, and is oftentimes seen as a kind of Shakespeare figure. And what Puck does is offer an apology, but it is a backhanded apology, which is not surprising considering the character of Puck, because he says, if I am an honest Puck. The thing is, we know that Puck is not honest. So that negates everything he says when he says that he's sorry if he's offended. So that perhaps is one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. There are many famous speeches in Shakespeare. But you can see that in the notes below. What I've done is I've divided up, starting in section D, our different acts about what's going on in Act 1, what's going on in Act 2, and then finally Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. And then in section I, some of the themes of the play: that love makes everybody, regardless of age or status, an ass, an idiot. Love destroys friendships. Love is like a magic spell. Love is like a dream. Beauty need not be tall and blonde, which is something that we saw in Shakespeare's sonnets. Females can defy powerful male figures and sometimes be successful, albeit not always. Virginity is incredibly important in this play, and yet it is set in midsummer. And also there's reference to May Day, which are two pagan sexual holidays. In fact, a woman would be viewed as damaged goods if she was not virginal. And there are references within the text to illustrate that both females are virginal. And that ultimately, for instance, when Hermia is running away with Lysander, and they're in the woods alone, Lysander wants to lie close to her, and she doesn't want that because she's afraid temptation will take over and they will consummate their relationship before marriage. And that's why the marriage bed was so important, because that was where consummation was supposed to occur after marriage. And the idea, too, of Helena chasing Demetrius in the forest. At one point he threatens her and says, if you continue to chase me, I shall do thee mischief in the woods, which means that I will take your virginity. So that is embedded in our understanding of a play that's set in a very sexually charged time. So Shakespeare likes to offer us dichotomies. And a little piece of trivia, the donkey or the ass, and of course this is so important because Bottom is an ass, and then eventually he's literally turned into an ass, was known to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So there's some sexual humor here. In fact, some might even, suggest the idea of an animal and a fairy being a kind of bestiality. But regardless, what I wanted to talk about next class were those 5 acts, and also talk about our upcoming paper. And what I wanted for you to consider with our attendance question for our discussion forum, which is due or will be due on Wednesday the 4th. And certainly, if you need an extension, ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but I certainly encourage you to respond to your peers, and you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you a good idea of the kind of class conversation we would have in a face-to-face class. Is now that I've talked about the play a bit, your attendance question is to identify an important quote someplace in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and more importantly, why you think that quote is important. And of course, I will finish up next class with talking about the 5 acts of the play a little bit more, and then we will transition into our first paper and talking a bit more about that. And what is coming up, our next play, is Much Ado About Nothing. And you'll notice that I've given you a link for that in the J section under next classes. So this is in the Folger Shakespeare. And we will again see a performance, a very different kind of performance. But more on that later. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.